Hello, everyone. This is Steve Palladino from Palladino Power Project, bringing you a video. This one's in for discussion of a poll that I put on the Palladino Power Project Facebook group. And the poll essentially said that you have a runner who, in late February, does a CP test in 10-degree temps, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, um, and had a CP estimate that resulted from that test of 295 watts. And then now in April, it's warmer conditions, and the athlete did a CP test, and it was 20 degrees Celsius and 68 degrees Fahrenheit temps, and got a 295-watt CP estimate once again. So apparently, no change, at least on the surface. And further, I wrote the test execution looks good in both cases, so valid test results apparently. Humidity and altitude are the same. And I asked, how would you interpret the runner's CP? Well, uh, in the thread, there's a lot of other questions by the Facebook group members on other aspects of this runner, and so I'll add that it's all else is being equal, meaning all the other variables. We're going to get to that in a second. Um, but the options that I listed were CP improved relatively, CP declined relatively, CP stayed the same, there is no fitness change. And options 1 and 4 were CP stayed the same was number 1, and no fitness change was option number 4. And the answer that I chose, I didn't vote, but the one that I would have chose is that CP improved relatively. And that's what I want to go into. But before I go further, I'm just going to preface this. The issue here is power is relative. Power, looking at power in absolute watts, um, is of little value unless it's related to something. So power will change relative to temperature, humidity, altitude, other variables which we're going to go into. It's relative. The power that the human organism can produce is going to be impacted by various environmental conditions and perhaps other technical conditions as well. And in training, power is relative. We're usually not just picking raw watts out of thin air. We're relating it to as a percent of CP or a percent of the person's power duration curve. Other ways of relating it. Is this interval target related to that person's 5K power, etc.? Power is relative. It's best not to think of it as this standalone element, and it needs to be compared. So that's the preface. Let's look at a quick slide here, and basically, I wrote this slide a while ago, and it allows us to consider the variables that we have to look at when comparing two files from separate time periods. Um, and this is a case. And so, first of all, was the stride pod type the same? Was it a wind pod or non-wind pod? And so you have to ask that, and actually, one or two people in their responses to the poll said, was a pod type the same? Well, yes. This is an important question to ask because a wind pod is going to produce higher power for the same relative effort because of the added air power. Was pod type the same? In this case, yes, all else is being equal. The only variable we're managing here or changing was temperature. Another one that you should always ask was the stride weight setting the same? If the weight setting is lower, then the relative power is going to be lower. If the weight setting is higher, the relative power is going to be higher in terms of watts. And this question was asked in the comments for this poll. And again, no, for this example, weight setting stayed the same. If using the stride wind pod, was the reported air power the same? Because if the air power was, let's say, was normal in the first test, let's say it was about 5% in the 3-minute test and 3% in the 10-minute test. Was it the same in the second test? Let's say the person changed shoes and now they're getting 1% air power reported. Well, that depending on the shoes, it may be erroneous air power reporting. So the second result was underreported power. And if they had the right shoes, the right air power reporting, their power would have been even higher. Their result in CP would have been even higher. But in this case, again, all else equal. So air power was the same for this case as well. Was the relative intensity, now you're going to always ask this, you don't want to compare a file where the runner is doing mostly a long run versus a file where they're doing a half marathon power tempo. They can be significantly different in terms of the metrics. So the relative intensity should be about approximately the same. Well, in this case, CP test, we're going maximum in both. So yes, relative intensity was the same in both. Was the route and terrain the same, the hilliness? Now, this question speaks less to the power element, except for extremes of grade, and more to running effectiveness, because if you're comparing running effectiveness over two files, unless the route and terrain were the same and the wind was the same, then running effectiveness is not comparable. In this case, again, all else being equal, yes, it is running on the same route, same terrain for both tests. Were the conditions, environmental conditions in particular, approximately the same? And this is where this particular poll is getting at. We're changing heat, we're keeping humidity and altitude the same. And I'll come back to that. I like to use altitude as an analogy to the changing heat. So we'll come back to that. Was the distance calibration the same? In other words, was the auto calibrate turned off and the same calibration factor? This speaks to comparing running effectiveness across different files. And again, we're going to just say all else being equal. So yes, everything was the same there. Was it the same shoes, same pod positioning? That's an important question when you're comparing two files, is looking at those variables as well, because those variables can change power reporting and even running effectiveness reporting slightly. Again, we're going to say the same shoes, same pod positioning for this case. And we're training load metrics. One person asked about that. Was relative fatigue for both tests? Because if one test was conducted under say a B race taper, and the other one was conducted where the TSB was minus 25, minus 30, and their CTL ramp rate was very positive, positive 3 or something like that. It's not comparable, because one, they're more fatigued and maybe they're not able to perform at the same level. Again, in this case, we are all else being equal. So yes, they taper to about the same level in both cases. So Again, remember this particular slide with all these different variables, because to compare one power file with another power file, there's all these different elements that change how relative the two files are, how well you can relate one to the other. So, um, so again, for purposes of this poll, everything was the same except for the heat in this particular case. But for you as a knowledgeable power user, when you compare two files, and comparing a file from last February to this February, you got to remember, hey, did I change pods? Did I change shoes, etc.? You got to consider all of these variables when you are going about comparing them, because there could be some nuances, and typically the more astute you are, the more keyed into these little nuances. So definitely keep these in mind as you compare files. But let's get back to our example, and basically, here's how you can get an idea of what the correct answer is. At least what I would suggest. In this case, you go to the Superpower Calculator and you can compare different files, in this case, different CP test files from one to the other. Now, one of the respondents to the poll said they always normalize, they always correct their CP, temperature, humidity, and altitude for that particular CP test. They always correct it to a normal set of environmental conditions. So then every CP test you've converted to a normalized set of conditions, you can actually compare relative change. So with the Superpower Calculator, you come down to this particular calculator, adjust power, air power, or FTP based on altitude, temperature, humidity. Click on that. As always, the required elements are in this gold color, and optional is in blue, and then the outcome is in green. So we're putting in 295 watts, and there's several ways you can answer this particular question. Or, if you're looking at your particular files, and remember, we're in a period where, at least in the northern hemisphere, we're working from colder temperatures to warmer temperatures, and you got to understand that the power is relative. And as it gets warmer, the human organism physiologically starts to decline in its potential power output, assuming all else equal. So 295 watts was the first test, and it was done in 10 degrees, and we're going to compare that to 20 degrees, the second test. So what we're doing is we're converting the first test at 295 watts to the same conditions as in the second test. So again, altitude stayed the same, humidity stayed the same, but temperature went from 10 in February to 20 in early April. And so what that means is that 295 done in 10 degrees would actually be about 290.5 in 20 degrees. All right? And he did 295 in 20 degrees. So there's a difference. It's about a 4.5 watt difference. 4.5 watt difference. There's another way you can do it. You can go the opposite. You can say, okay, hey, I just did 295. Let's compare that to what it would be if I did it back in February. So I'm looking at my April tests. 295 watts was the result, and 20 degrees, what would it be at 10 degrees? So again, I enter those values, and at 10 degrees, that 295 at 20 would equal to about 299.5 at 10. So again, 4.5 watts difference. This one is better than the last one. Or you can do it this way. You could do, like I said earlier, that one respondent said they always normalize their CP tests to a standard set of conditions. Let's say we're going to standardize ours to 100 meters, 70%, and 21 Celsius. We're just standardizing that. So the first one, 295 at 10 degrees, if you standardize that to the 21, and because all of your CP tests you're standardizing to these set of conditions, so that's equivalent to about 289.6 watts at 21, that first test. So the first test at 21 is worth about 289.6 watts. Now, if on the second test they did 295 at 20 degrees, how does that standardize to 21? Again, converting every CP test to 21. It equates to 294. So we went from 289.6 to 294. Again, about 4.5 watts roughly. All right, so about 4.5 watts difference towards the April test being superior to the February test. And that's the correct answer, in my opinion, is that the April test, same resultant number, 295, but relatively, remember, power is relatively, it's a superior performance. It was done in warmer conditions. Superpower calculator helps elucidate that. Now, you could do a counter argument. Well, this could be within the measurement error or retest error, and that's true. That's true. We're speaking of a theoretical case, but if I were evaluating a runner file, and you're looking at all these other elements, how they're performing in their training, et cetera, I would say, hey, that 295 is better. You've actually improved a little bit over this last 6 weeks. All right. Now, then what do you use for your CP or FTP for training purposes? Well, now you're into warmer temperatures. Now, your temperatures are closer to 20. If it's, plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius or 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, you're still, you're still in a reasonably the same sort of conditions. And so I would use 295 again, but now that 295 is more appropriate for those temperatures. And we verified it with a CP test done in those temperatures. So rather than guess, we do the CP tests in the more current training temperatures, and we see the difference, or essentially the same number, 295, but in terms of the targets, they are a little bit harder because they're being done in less power-friendly conditions than what were present in February. So hopefully that helps explain the answer I was looking for, and understand there are nuances to this analysis, but given the time period we're in, that we're going into warmer conditions, keep in mind the CP value that you established in February is in colder conditions is not necessarily the right CP value for what's going on now. And if you use AutoCP, that is an issue with AutoCP or any model that's based on 90 days of data, because it's got more power-friendly condition generated data in that database, which is sort of inflating that power target a little bit relative to the current conditions. So my feeling personally is as temperatures are starting to change dramatically into less power friendly, you want to do more of a CP test or um, do a model optimizing set of tests. But again, realize those tests may not change the model at all because they're done in less power friendly conditions. The CP test is the better way of going in that scenario. So thank you for participating in the poll. If you did answer the poll, and uh, obviously the majority of people, vast majority of people, are selecting the answer I was looking for. Again, understandably, there's other options that were selected, and there's probably some good reasons for that, and that gets into some of the nuances that I was speaking of earlier. Thank you for participating in the poll. Thank you for watching the video. Talk to you next time.